Why was she trembling when all she had done was stand still? The morning sun cut sharp lines across the parade ground at Fort Braxton, and Sarah Martinez could feel its heat seeping through the fabric of her uniform. It wasn't nerves about the inspection itself. Not exactly. She had trained for this moment, memorized the regulations, polished her boots until her reflection stared back at her. But still, she felt like an exposed target under the gaze of 100 eyes. Her breath clouded faintly in the crisp October air. She tried to steady it, but her chest tightened when she caught sight of the cadets beside her. Their uniforms looked the same, crisp, new, issued only weeks ago. No frayed seams, no faded fabric, no stories hidden in the threads. Hers was different, too different. Sarah knew they had already noticed. She'd heard it in the whispers as she fell into formation that morning. Cadet Thompson's laugh, sharp as broken glass. Cadet Williams leaning close, smirking like a boy who thought cruelty was clever. "Check out Martinez's costume," Thompson had murmured. "Did she raid a thrift store?" "Look at that sleeve," Williams had added, low but not low enough. "Not even regulation. That patch doesn't belong anywhere." Their voices still echoed in her ears. She had kept her eyes front, jaw tight, her posture unbroken. That was the rule. Never let them see you flinch. But the heat had risen in her cheeks, hot enough to burn. She had wanted to turn and tell them the truth, that this uniform was not cheap, not random, not borrowed from a dusty rack. It was her father's. But even that truth felt incomplete, because the truth was she didn't really know what all of it meant. The ribbons, the patches, especially the one they mocked. The one so worn it looked like nothing at all, its emblem only barely visible, a shadow of something forgotten. Her mother had never explained it. It was part of something classified, she had said once, avoiding Sarah's eyes. Things he couldn't talk about. And her grandmother, who had altered the uniform with careful, loving hands, had said only, "Your father wore this with pride. That's enough." But was it enough? On this day, inspection day, when every thread was supposed to match the book, when every detail was measured against perfection. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing her spine straighter. She had chosen this uniform, chosen it knowing it would stand out. She had wanted to honor him, to wear the weight of his memory against her skin. But now, with Thompson's laughter still ringing in her ears, she wondered if she had made a mistake that could end her career before it began. The sound of engines cut through her thoughts. A sleek black sedan rolled up beside the parade ground, its tires crunching over gravel. The formation stiffened as Master Sergeant Rodriguez barked the order to attention. Sarah's pulse hammered. Colonel Patricia Hawthorne stepped out of the car. Her dress blues were immaculate, her medals a map of decades spent under fire. Every story Sarah had heard about her was the same, sharp, unsparing, and utterly fair. She saw through weakness. She saw through excuses. And she could end a cadet's career with a single note in her inspection file. Sarah's throat went dry. The colonel began her slow walk down the line. Every step was measured. Her eyes, sharp as steel, flicked from face to uniform, catching details no one else would notice. She corrected a ribbon placement here, adjusted a collar there. Nothing escaped her. When she stopped in front of Thompson, she spoke only briefly. "Ribbon too high, fix it." Then she moved on. Thompson's smirk had already vanished. Williams fared little better, earning a correction for a misplaced insignia. Then it was Sarah's turn. Colonel Hawthorne stopped, her gaze sweeping from head to toe. For a heartbeat her face was unreadable. Then her eyes lingered, on the sleeve, on the faded patch. Sarah felt the air thicken around her. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears. This was it, the mistake, the humiliation. She braced herself for the order to step out of formation, for the lecture that would end everything. "Cadet Martinez," the colonel said, her voice carrying across the parade ground. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah's voice was steady, though inside she was crumbling. "Step forward." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Sarah could feel the eyes of every cadet drilling into her back as she took one step forward, boots striking the pavement with a hollow echo. Behind her, she caught the faint sound of muffled laughter. Thompson again. The colonel circled her slowly, eyes scanning every inch of fabric. The weight of that gaze was unbearable. Sarah fought the instinct to shrink under it. Her father's uniform pressed against her shoulders like armor, but armor could also feel like chains. When the colonel came to stand before her again, something had shifted. Her expression was still controlled but softer, almost curious. "Where did you acquire this uniform?" she asked. Sarah hesitated only a breath. "It belonged to my father, ma'am, Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, deceased." The colonel's eyes narrowed, studying her face, then dropped again to the sleeve. She raised one hand, almost reverent, and touched the faded patch. "And this emblem, do you know what it represents?" Sarah's throat tightened. Her voice wavered, but she forced the words out. "No, ma'am, my father never spoke of it. My mother said it was classified." A murmur rippled through the cadets. The colonel's hand rose, silencing them with a simple gesture. Her gaze sharpened, then locked onto Sarah's eyes. "Cadet Martinez, what unit did your father serve with?" "The 75th Ranger Regiment, ma'am. At least, that's what we were told." For the first time, Sarah saw something flicker across Colonel Hawthorne's face. Not doubt, not disapproval, but something closer to recognition, to memory. Her eyes softened almost imperceptibly before she gave a small nod. "Turn around, cadet." Sarah obeyed, snapping into a perfect about-face. She could feel the colonel's eyes tracing her back, pausing at something Sarah herself couldn't see. Her palms began to sweat. "Face me." She turned again, and this time when she met the colonel's eyes, the air between them had changed. No longer cold, no longer evaluative, but heavy, personal. The colonel's voice carried differently now, quieter but edged with something powerful. "Cadet Martinez, your father didn't just serve with the 75th Rangers." The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah felt her heart lurch, the ground tilt beneath her. She wanted to ask, to demand, but she couldn't speak. She could only stand rigid as the colonel's words cut through the air. "That patch your classmates find so amusing," the colonel paused, letting the weight of it settle, "is from Task Force Legacy, Legacy 9, one of the most classified operations of the Afghanistan War." The snickering stopped instantly. Thompson and Williams exchanged quick, panicked glances, the blood draining from their faces. Sarah's breath caught. Task Force Legacy. She had heard the name only in fragments, whispers in military documentaries, always followed by words like redacted or unknown. And her father, her quiet, unassuming father, had been part of it. Colonel Hawthorne stepped closer. Her voice was steady, but Sarah heard something else beneath it. Respect, memory, maybe even grief. "Your father was part of a 12-man team that spent 8 months behind enemy lines. Their intelligence prevented attacks on 3 major U.S. bases. Only 5 of them came home alive." Sarah's eyes widened. For 12 years she had lived in the shadow of questions her family never answered. Now, here, in front of the entire formation, she was hearing pieces of the truth for the first time. Her chest tightened. Her hands trembled at her sides. She wanted to speak, but her voice had deserted her. The colonel straightened, her tone sharpening again, but not with anger, with reverence. "That patch outranks every insignia in this formation, including mine." The words struck like thunder. And Sarah realized in that moment that the uniform she had been ashamed of, the one that made her feel small and out of place, was heavier with history and sacrifice than any of them could comprehend. But there was something else, something the colonel had not yet said. Sarah could see it in her eyes, waiting just behind the words. And she knew this was only the beginning. What happens when the ground beneath your story shifts? When the father you thought you knew becomes someone else entirely? Sarah stood frozen in the October sunlight, the colonel's words echoing like distant artillery fire. Task Force Legacy, Legacy 9. The names reverberated through her mind, hollow, heavy, impossible. Her father, the man who used to braid her hair before school, who taught her to steady her breathing when she got nervous, who whispered bedtime stories about courage without ever mentioning his own, had been part of something no one spoke about. Something that changed wars. Something people like Thompson and Williams couldn't begin to imagine. But the colonel wasn't finished. "Your father's team operated in silence," she said, her voice carrying over the stunned cadets. "Their records were sealed, their missions erased from public knowledge. Even their uniforms were designed to fade with time so that only those who truly knew would recognize them. That patch you wear, Cadet Martinez, is not a mistake. It is history. It is sacrifice stitched into fabric." Sarah's chest rose and fell, shallow breaths catching in her throat. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but the formation held her still. She could only stand there, a cadet in her father's shadow, as the colonel turned to the others. "Let this be a lesson to you all," Hawthorne continued, her eyes sweeping the line. "You judged what you did not understand. You mocked a legacy greater than your own knowledge. Remember this moment. Respect is not always worn on a clean uniform. Sometimes it lives in the faded threads of those who gave everything." Thompson's smirk was gone. His jaw worked, clenched tight, and for once he had no words. Williams shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado collapsing into shame. Around them, the other cadets stared straight ahead, but their silence carried more weight than any insult. Sarah felt something stir inside her, not triumph, not vindication, but something quieter. Pride, fragile and aching, breaking through years of unanswered questions. Still, the colonel's gaze lingered on her, sharp, unrelenting. "Your father never spoke of it because he couldn't. He carried secrets heavier than metals, and he carried them until his last breath." Sarah blinked rapidly. Her throat burned. She wanted to hold herself steady, to keep bearing like the soldier she was training to be, but the words carved deeper than she expected. She remembered him in fragments, his boots by the door, his quiet laugh when she asked if he was afraid of the dark, his voice telling her stories, not about battles but about rivers, mountains, and stars, always stars. Now she understood why. Colonel Hawthorne shifted her stance, facing Sarah fully. Her tone dropped, intimate yet firm. "Your father's final mission was one I will never forget. He saved lives that day, mine included." A tremor ran through Sarah's chest. She could feel every eye on her, but the world had shrunk to just the two of them. This woman who knew pieces of her father's story that even her family had been denied. "Cadet Martinez," Hawthorne said, "you carry more than a name, you carry a legacy. Do you understand?" Sarah wanted to say yes. She wanted to nod, to speak, to prove she wasn't just a girl wearing a faded uniform. But the words stuck, because the truth was she didn't understand. Not fully, not yet. The colonel's eyes softened almost imperceptibly. She gave a small nod, as if recognizing Sarah's silence for what it was, the weight of a daughter trying to reconcile memory with revelation. Then, sharp as a blade, her voice cut through the still air. "Dismissed." The formation broke, boots striking pavement in perfect rhythm as cadets marched away. Sarah remained where she was, unable to move, the echoes of her father's name rattling through her bones. "Cadet Martinez," the colonel called again, "stay behind." Her pulse spiked. She obeyed, standing rigid as the others filed off, their glances flicking toward her with a mixture of awe, pity, and confusion. Thompson and Williams avoided her gaze entirely, their earlier mockery replaced with something closer to dread. When the last of them disappeared beyond the barracks, silence fell heavy over the parade ground. Only the rustle of trees and the distant hum of drills carried through the air. Colonel Hawthorne's expression shifted. The razor-edged inspector melted into someone else, still firm but human. She gestured toward a bench beneath a sprawling oak at the edge of the field. "Walk with me, cadet." Sarah hesitated, then followed, boots crunching over gravel. Her heart still pounded, her thoughts a storm she couldn't control. They sat. For a long moment the colonel said nothing, simply staring at the horizon where the sun burned against pale autumn sky. Finally, she spoke. "Your father saved my life." The words dropped like a stone. Sarah turned to her, stunned. The colonel's face was calm, but her eyes carried years of memory, weight that could not be spoken lightly. "It was during Legacy 9, Hawthorne continued. Our position was compromised. Insurgents surrounded us. He held them off, alone, while I and 2 others made it to extraction. He refused evacuation until every last one of us was safe." Sarah's breath hitched. Her father's voice echoed faintly in her memory, "Tell them it was worth it." Words she hadn't understood, words her mother had repeated once, quietly, as if they meant something more. Now she knew. Colonel Hawthorne's voice faltered just slightly. "The last thing he said to me was that line. I carried it for 12 years, wondering what he meant. Today, looking at you, I understand." Sarah's eyes blurred. She blinked hard, but tears slipped free, tracing hot lines down her cheeks. She hated that she couldn't control them, hated that in uniform she was breaking apart. But the colonel didn't chastise her. She let the silence stretch, honoring it. Why didn't anyone tell us?" Sarah whispered. "Because he asked for it." The colonel's reply was steady, though her voice softened. "He made enemies who would never forget. To protect you, your mother, your family, he requested that his story remain hidden until the threat was gone. Only recently have those networks been dismantled." Sarah sat in silence, the revelation settling over her like a second skin. Her father hadn't just kept secrets, he had kept her safe. "And now?" she asked, voice raw. "Now," the colonel said, "his story can be told, and his family can finally be recognized." Sarah turned away, staring at the training fields beyond, where cadets drilled in crisp precision. Recognition. The word felt foreign. She had never wanted glory. She had only wanted to know, to understand. But the colonel wasn't done. "The Pentagon is planning a ceremony," Hawthorne continued. "Arlington National Cemetery. They will award your father the Medal of Honor, posthumously. His legacy will finally be acknowledged." Sarah's heart clenched. The Medal of Honor, the highest recognition of courage, of sacrifice. The kind of thing children learned about in history class, never expecting it to touch their own family. She pressed her lips together, trying to breathe. Her father, the man she had lost at 12, the man who never told her why. Now she knew. She turned back to the colonel. "Why tell me all this? You could have corrected the others and moved on." For the first time the colonel smiled. Not a sharp smile, not one carved by authority, but a human one. "Because I made him a promise, that if anything ever happened to him, I would look after his family. It has taken 12 years, but today I begin keeping that promise." Sarah's chest ached. She wanted to answer, but her voice broke before words formed. And then the colonel added something that made the air shift again. "There's more. The Pentagon is forming a new task force, built on Legacy's foundation. They want the children of Legacy veterans, those who understand sacrifice not as a word, but as blood in the dirt." Sarah's head jerked up. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying," Hawthorne interrupted gently, "that one day when you are ready, there will be a place for you." The weight of the offer crashed over her. Legacy, her father's shadow, his unfinished mission. But was she ready to step into it? Could she? Her chest rose and fell, her silence answering louder than words. The colonel didn't press. She simply rose, offered her hand, and said softly, "Think about it." Sarah took the hand, firm grip, eyes locked, and for the first time she felt the stirrings of something stronger than shame, something larger than grief. The beginning of her own legacy. But still questions burned. What exactly had her father seen? What had he done? What scars had he carried home in silence? She didn't know, not yet. And that uncertainty, was the shadow she would carry forward. What do you do the morning after the world tilts? Sarah woke before dawn, her body tense as if the bugle had already sounded. She sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at the folded uniform beside her. Not her father, not today. The regulation cadet issue, pressed and precise. She had made that choice deliberately, but when her hand brushed the sleeve of her father's faded jacket, she felt the weight of it all over again. The barracks were still quiet, most cadets lost in uneasy sleep, but word had spread. She knew it would. By sunrise, whispers would circle like hawks. Martinez, the Gold Star daughter. Martinez, the one with the secret patch. Martinez, the colonel's chosen. Her jaw tightened. She hated the thought of being defined by a story she hadn't earned. She wanted to be measured by her own sweat, her own grit, not by a legacy she still struggled to understand. Still, when formation began that morning, the air was different. She could feel it in the way others glanced at her, quick and fleeting, a mixture of respect and unease. Thompson and Williams stood stiff, their arrogance buried under shame. They didn't look her way, not once. As the drill sergeant barked orders, Sarah's body obeyed out of habit, but her mind drifted. She kept seeing her father's face, not the few photographs tucked in drawers at home, but flashes from memory. The way he had smiled at her birthday cake. The way he had adjusted the strap of her backpack on her first day of school. Small moments, ordinary, now reframed against extraordinary truths. Eyes forward, Martinez. Sergeant Rodriguez's voice cut sharp, snapping her back. She corrected her stance, cheeks flushing. But even as she moved through the drills, the colonel's words replayed. The Pentagon is forming a new task force. They want the children of legacy veterans. Could she carry that, or would she always crumble beneath its weight? Later that day, after drills and lectures, she found Thompson and Williams waiting near the mess hall doors. Their shoulders stiffened when she approached, and for a moment she thought they'd look away, pretend she wasn't there. But Thompson stepped forward. His voice, usually slick with sarcasm, was stripped down to rawness. Martinez, I owe you an apology. We both do. He glanced at Williams, who nodded quickly, eyes down. We didn't know, Williams said. His tone wavered. But ignorance isn't an excuse. We disrespected your father. We disrespected you. Sarah studied them. Every part of her wanted to let the anger surface, to throw their cruelty back at them. But another voice whispered, her father's, patient and steady, respect isn't demanded, it's earned. So she drew a breath and said, what matters is what you do next. Be better than you were yesterday. Their eyes flickered with relief, with something like gratitude. They nodded, awkward but sincere. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a path forward. That night, lying awake, Sarah replayed the encounter. She realized that leadership wasn't in shouting the loudest or carrying the sharpest uniform. It was in moments like these, when others' flaws pressed against your own, and you chose to lift rather than crush. Still, the deeper questions gnawed at her. What had her father endured on that mission? What ghosts had followed him home, hidden behind the silence he carried until his death? The days blurred into routine, lectures, drills, exhaustion, but beneath it all a new current ran. Her classmates treated her differently now. Some with admiration, others with distance, but all with an awareness they hadn't carried before. She worked harder than ever, not to prove her father's worth, but to prove her own. Push-ups until her arms burned, marches until her legs screamed. Hours spent helping weaker cadets with study sessions long past lights out. And slowly, quietly, respect began to grow, not because of the patch, but because of her. Yet as weeks passed, one thought anchored her every night: the Arlington ceremony. Colonel Hawthorne had given her only fragments: Medal of Honor, recognition long overdue, families gathering after years in the shadows. Sarah's chest tightened whenever she thought of it. Pride and dread tangled together. What would it feel like to stand there in front of strangers, carrying a father she barely knew? When the day came, the sky was heavy with gray. Washington's autumn winds carried the scent of fallen leaves and stone. Arlington stretched wide, rows of white markers cutting clean lines into the earth. Sarah walked with her mother and grandmother, the silence between them thick with years of unspoken grief. Her mother's hand trembled as she adjusted the scarf around her neck. Her grandmother, though frail, carried herself with quiet dignity. Together they joined other families, faces lined with loss, eyes searching for connection in shared absence. Sarah felt small among them, yet when she looked closer, she saw herself reflected. Sons and daughters who had grown up with half-stories, wives who had endured silence, mothers who had buried hope alongside folded flags. The ceremony began with the cadence of honor guards, rifles gleaming, boots striking earth in unison. The flag rippled under the weight of wind. And then, one by one, names were read. Men of Legacy 9. Some survived, most did not. When her father's name echoed across the cemetery, Sarah's knees nearly buckled. She held her breath as the Medal of Honor citation was read aloud. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty. The words blurred as tears burned her eyes. She barely heard the rest, only fragments. Covered retreat, prevented greater loss, laid down his life so others could live. When the medal was presented to her mother, Sarah reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. Her mother's tears flowed silently, falling onto the ribbon. Her grandmother whispered something in Spanish, an old prayer, half plea, half thanksgiving. And Sarah stood there, stiff in her cadet uniform, with the weight of history pressing down. After the ceremony, families gathered in quiet clusters. Sarah found herself approached by a man with weathered eyes and a limp that told its own story. He introduced himself as Sergeant Cole, one of the 5 who came home. "I fought beside your father," he said, his voice cracked. "He saved us, saved me. I've wanted to meet you for years." Sarah's chest tightened. What was he like out there? Cole's gaze softened. Steady, brave, but more than that, he never lost sight of why we fought. Not for medals, not for glory, for people. For villages, for children he'd never meet. For you. Sarah's vision blurred. She had to bite her lip to keep from breaking down entirely. Cole placed a hand on her shoulder. "He carried you with him, every day. He showed us your picture once, said you were the reason he could keep going when the nights got too long." Her breath caught. No story had ever hit harder. When the families parted ways that evening, Sarah lingered among the rows of white markers, the cold wind biting her cheeks. She traced the engraved name with her fingertips, whispering words she'd never been able to say aloud. "I'll make you proud, Dad, I promise." The vow echoed into the silence, binding itself to the soil. That night, as the city lights glowed beyond Arlington's gates, Sarah realized something had shifted again. The mystery of her father's life would never be fully revealed. Some files would remain locked forever, some truths buried with him. But what mattered wasn't the pieces she didn't know. It was the fire he had left behind. And now it was hers to carry. Still, she knew the hardest part lay ahead, because Colonel Hawthorne's offer still lingered like a shadow, a new task force, a chance to step into his world. And with it the same risk, the same silence, the same sacrifice. Could she choose that path, or would it consume her the way it consumed him? The question lingered long after the cemetery faded into night. And Sarah knew the answer would come not in words but in the battles ahead. What do you do when silence follows the storm? The bus ride back to Fort Braxton was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against the windows and makes every thought louder. Sarah sat near the back, her cadet cap pulled low, her eyes fixed on the blur of trees rushing past. Her mother and grandmother had returned home after Arlington, holding the Medal of Honor like a fragile piece of time. Sarah had returned to base with something less tangible but heavier, an unspoken promise. The ceremony had burned itself into her. The weight of the folded flag, the faces of men who had known her father in the fire, the words Sergeant Cole had whispered, "He carried you with him." And now, every step she took back onto the parade ground felt different. Not because others looked at her differently, though they did, but because she looked at herself differently. She wasn't just a cadet in training. She was a thread in a story still being woven. The first morning back, Sergeant Rodriguez barked them into drills with his usual ferocity. Sweat burned, muscles screamed, but Sarah pushed harder than ever. Every sprint was a vow. Every push-up was a prayer. She could feel her classmates watching her, not with envy but with something quieter: respect. By the end of the session, Thompson approached her, sweat streaming down his face. His voice was low, stripped of arrogance. "Martinez, we've been working on squad formations. You're sharper than any of us. Think you could help us figure it out?" It wasn't just an apology. It was an invitation. Sarah studied him, her breath still ragged. Weeks ago, his smirk would have grated like sandpaper. Now he looked like a cadet trying to shed his skin. She gave a short nod. After chow, meet in the drill yard. That evening, a small group gathered: Thompson, Williams, two others. They stood in the fading light as Sarah demonstrated pivots, corrected their spacing, walked them through every beat of precision until their movements began to sync. No mocking this time. No sneers. Only concentration, sweat, and the quiet bond of shared effort. When they finally dismissed, Williams lingered. His voice was awkward but sincere. "You're different than we thought." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "You don't carry yourself like someone who expects privilege, even though you could, with who your father was." She met his eyes. "Because that's not who I am, and it's not who I'm going to be." He nodded, and for once there was no trace of arrogance, only humility. In the weeks that followed, Sarah became something unexpected: a leader. Not by rank, not by assignment, but by presence. She was the one cadets sought when they fell behind in studies. The one who pushed harder during runs, setting the pace without demanding it. The one who steadied others when doubt gnawed at them. But late at night, when the barracks went quiet, the doubts turned inward. Colonel Hawthorne's offer lingered like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. A new task force, built on legacy. A path that would demand everything and give nothing back but silence and sacrifice. She lay awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, wondering if stepping into her father's world would honor him or repeat his fate. Would she end up a name carved in stone, leaving someone else to wonder in the dark? The conflict gnawed at her, even as her days grew sharper, stronger. One Friday afternoon, the cadets were assembled for weapons qualification. Sarah's rifle felt steady in her hands, the weight familiar, comforting. She breathed in, exhaled, and squeezed, each shot landing with precision. Her instructors noted her scores, quiet nods of approval following her. But when the range cleared, she stayed behind, staring at the paper silhouette riddled with holes. She remembered the colonel's voice: "Your father saved my life." She remembered Cole's words: "He carried you with him." And she whispered into the wind: "Could I carry others the way he did?" The answer didn't come, only the echo of gunfire fading into silence. Her chance to test herself came sooner than expected. During a field exercise the following week, her squad was tasked with navigating through rough terrain, simulating enemy contact. It was supposed to be routine, training, nothing more. But halfway through, one cadet twisted his ankle on a hidden route. Panic rippled through the group as he stumbled, grimacing, unable to keep pace. The exercise clock ticked, failure loomed. Sarah dropped beside him without hesitation. "Lean on me," she said. Her voice was sharp, commanding, leaving no room for refusal. She slung his arm over her shoulders and bore the weight. Every step slowed her pace, dragged at her strength, but she didn't falter. "Move," she barked to the others. "Keep formation, we're not failing this." They obeyed, and somehow they crossed the finish. Late, exhausted, but intact. The instructor's critique was sharp. They had failed the time requirement, but when his eyes settled on Sarah, his tone shifted. "You carried him when you could have left him. That's what leadership looks like. Remember that." Later, as she sat on the grass, sweat soaking her uniform, Thompson dropped beside her. "You know, you didn't have to do that, but you did." Sarah wiped her brow, staring at the horizon. "Because leaving people behind isn't an option." The words tasted like her father's. That night, Colonel Hawthorne summoned her to the administrative building. Sarah's pulse quickened as she entered, the sterile fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The colonel stood by her desk, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "You've grown," she said without preamble. "Not just in skill, in presence." Sarah swallowed. "I'm just doing my best, ma'am." "No, you're becoming what this uniform demands. There's a difference." The colonel stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. "I've watched you, cadet, and I see what your father saw, what he carried into every mission. The question is, will you accept it?" Sarah's chest tightened, the offer, again, hanging between them like an unspoken oath. She forced herself to meet the colonel's eyes. "I don't know if I can live up to him." "You won't," Hawthorne replied sharply. Then softer, "Because you're not him, you're you, and that's enough." Sarah's throat ached. She wanted to believe those words, but doubt still gnawed. What if stepping into legacy wasn't honoring him, but chasing a ghost she could never catch? The colonel seemed to read her thoughts. "Legacy is not about imitation, it's about continuation. Your father gave his life so others could live. What you give will be your choice. But make no mistake, the choice will come." Sarah left the office with her pulse hammering. Outside, the night air was cool, the stars sharp above. She looked up, remembering the way her father used to point them out, nomming constellations as if they were old friends. For the first time, she wondered if those nights had been more than stories. Maybe they had been preparation, teaching her to navigate darkness, to find light even when the sky was endless black. But preparation for what? The question haunted her as weeks stretched on, drills blending into studies, days into nights. Her body grew stronger, her mind sharper, yet the shadow of decision remained. And then one evening she received a letter, not from her mother, not from her instructors, from the Pentagon. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Inside, a single sheet, an invitation, the formation of Task Force Legacy II, applications under review, candidates selected not for rank but for resilience, for understanding of sacrifice. Her name was listed among them. Her breath caught, the paper shook in her hands. The shadow had arrived. And now she would have to decide whether to step into it. What does a decision weigh when it could shape the rest of your life? Sarah stared at the letter on her desk, the Pentagon seal stamped across the top like a challenge. The barracks were quiet now, most cadets asleep, but she couldn't close her eyes, not with this paper burning a hole in her hands. Task Force Legacy II. Her name typed in stark black letters. An invitation, but also a test. She read it once, twice, 10 times. The words didn't change, the questions did. Could she say yes? Could she step into the shadow her father left behind? Or would she crumble under its weight, just another name whispered at a graveside? The doubts swirled, relentless. She folded the letter, tucked it beneath her pillow, and lay flat on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. But sleep refused her. Every creak of the building, every breath from the cadets around her felt magnified. She thought of the Arlington ceremony, of Sergeant Cole's words, of Colonel Hawthorne's steady gaze. And still, beneath it all, one thought echoed. If I fail, it won't just be my failure. It will stain his memory, too. The next weekend, she traveled home. The base had granted her a short leave, the kind given to cadets with family matters pressing on their shoulders. Her mother greeted her at the door with tired eyes and a hesitant smile. The Medal of Honor hung in its case on the wall, polished, untouchable. They sat at the kitchen table, the letter between them. The late afternoon sun spilled through the blinds, stripping the wood with gold and shadow. Her mother's hands trembled as she traced the Pentagon seal. "I don't want this for you," she whispered. "Not this life, not this danger." Sarah's chest tightened. She had expected the resistance, but hearing it, feeling the fear in her mother's voice, cut deeper than she thought it would. "Mom, I haven't decided," she said carefully. I need to understand what it means." Her mother's eyes flashed with something sharper, grief disguised as anger. "It means I bury you the way I buried him. It means another folded flag, another ceremony where words mean nothing against an empty seat at the table." Sarah flinched. Silence filled the space between them. The only sound was the clock ticking, heavy, relentless. Finally, her grandmother spoke. She had been quiet until then, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant. But when she lifted her eyes, they burned with clarity. "Your father made a choice," she said softly. "Not because it was safe, not because it was easy, but because he believed some things are worth more than his own life." Her mother turned sharply, "And look where it left us." The grandmother shook her head. "It left us with a name that carries honor. It left us with a daughter strong enough to stand where he stood." The words hit Sarah harder than any drill sergeant's bark. She swallowed, throat tight, caught between two forces pulling her in opposite directions. Her mother's fear, her grandmother's faith. That night, Sarah lay awake in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling she had once taped glow-in-the-dark stars onto. The Medal of Honor gleamed faintly in the hall, and her father's photograph, uniform sharp, smile gentle, watched from the dresser. She whispered into the dark, "What would you want me to do?" But of course no answer came, only silence, the kind he had carried with him, the kind that haunted every story left untold. When she returned to base, the weight of the decision pressed harder. Training felt sharper now, every drill reminding her of what might be waiting if she said yes. Her classmates seemed to sense the tension, giving her space, watching with curiosity but not daring to ask. It wasn't until Thompson caught her alone on the track one evening that someone spoke the words aloud. "You got the letter, didn't you?" Sarah stopped mid-stride, breath heavy, sweat slicking her brow. She turned slowly, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "How do you?" He shrugged. "Word travels. Besides, you've been walking around like you're carrying something heavier than your ruck." She narrowed her eyes. "And what do you think I should do?" He hesitated. For once there was no sarcasm in his tone, only honesty. "If it were me, I'd say no, I don't think I could carry it, but you're not me, Martinez. You've already shown us you're different, stronger. Maybe it's not about what he would do. Maybe it's about what you're meant to do." She studied him, surprised. Weeks ago, this same cadet had mocked her uniform. Now his words carried weight, growth, maybe even respect. Still, they didn't answer the question gnawing at her. The answer came in pieces. During weapons drills, she felt the calm settle in her chest, the way her father had once taught her. Steady breath, steady hand. During navigation exercises, she caught herself looking to the stars, remembering his voice numbing constellations, and realized she could still find her way by them. During leadership rotations, when cadets faltered and looked to her, she felt the strange, quiet certainty that she could guide them through. One night, unable to sleep, she returned to the range. The air was cool, the world hushed. She set her stance, raised her rifle, and fired. The shots cracked into the silence, precise, steady. Between each one, she whispered, "For you, bang. For Mom, bang. For every life you saved, bang. For every life I'll protect, bang." When the magazine emptied, she lowered the weapon, chest heaving, eyes burning. And in that moment she felt it, not the absence of doubt, but the presence of resolve. The next morning she wrote her reply. The pen shook slightly as she signed her name, but the letters were clear. Acceptance. When she handed the envelope to the courier, a strange calm settled over her. Fear still lingered, sharp at the edges, but beneath it was something deeper, a decision made, a path chosen. Colonel Hawthorne summoned her the following day. The colonel studied her silently as Sarah stood at attention, the faintest glimmer of pride in her eyes. "You've chosen," Hawthorne said, It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you understand what it means?" Sarah drew a breath. "I understand it means sacrifice, silence, risk, and I understand it means I might never be known for what I do, but I also understand it's not about me." For a long moment the colonel said nothing. Then she nodded, crisp, decisive. "Your father would be proud, and so am I." Sarah held her posture, but inside something cracked open. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter. A sense that, for the first time, she wasn't just walking in her father's shadow. She was walking beside it. That night she sat alone under the stars, her father's constellation stories echoing in her mind. She traced them with her eyes, whispering their names into the dark. And when the wind rustled through the trees, she almost imagined it carried his voice. Tell them it was worth it. And now for her it would be. What changes in you when the training stops being about passing and starts being about survival? Sarah felt it the moment she stepped off the bus at the undisclosed facility. It was Fort Braxton anymore. No familiar parade ground. No cadet instructors barking orders out of tradition. This was different, isolated, colder, a place stripped of ceremony and left only with function. The gates locked behind them, with a sound that echoed like finality. She was one of 20 candidates. Some she recognized, other cadets who had whispered stories of families lost, of fathers and mothers who never came home. Others were strangers, men and women whose eyes carried quiet burdens. Children of legacy veterans, pulled together by the invisible threads of history. Colonel Hawthorne was there to greet them, though her voice carried no warmth now. She was not mentor, not comfort. She was commander. From this moment forward, you are not cadets. You are candidates for legacy. If you fail, you will be dismissed quietly. If you succeed, you will carry secrets to your graves. The words sank like stones. Training began before dawn and ended long after the sun fell. Sleep was rationed, food stripped to basics, every ounce of energy demanded and redemanded. They ran through forests with weighted packs until their lungs felt like fire. They memorized codes and signals until their brains pulsed from exhaustion. They fired round after round on the range, not for points, but for silence, for the ability to kill without hesitation. And always there was the reminder, what you do here will never be spoken of. The first week nearly broke her. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could ache. Her palms blistered, her muscles screamed, her thoughts spiraled when the instructors deprived them of sleep until the world blurred at the edges. She dreamed of her father's voice but woke to shouting, to demands, to tasks designed to strip her down until nothing was left but raw determination. At night, lying on her cot in the darkened barracks, she wondered if she had made the wrong choice. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "It means I bury you the way I buried him." And yet, each time she thought she couldn't continue, she remembered the letter. Her father's picture in Cole's hand, the Medal of Honor in its case on the wall. And she pushed on. The second week brought something new, isolation drills. Each candidate was dropped into unfamiliar terrain with nothing but a map and compass. No comms, no support, just the knowledge that instructors were out there, watching, waiting to test every decision. When Sarah was dropped into dense woodland under cover of night, the silence pressed in like a weight. Every snapped twig sounded like an enemy, every shadow like a threat. Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to breathe steady, to remember her father's lesson. The dark is what kills you. Panic does. She navigated by stars, whispering constellations under her breath. Orion, Cassiopeia. The same words her father had taught her. When fatigue clawed at her legs, when doubt whispered she was lost, she pressed on. Hours later, she stumbled into the extraction zone. Late, exhausted, but there. The instructor gave no praise, only a curt nod. But in that nod, Sarah felt a spark, proof she could endure. Others didn't make it. Some came back broken, lost in fear. Others failed to return at all. Quiet dismissals followed. No announcements, just empty bunks in the barracks the next morning. Sarah carried their absence like stones in her pack. By the third week, the 20 had become 14. Faces hardened. Words grew fewer. Bonds formed in silence, not in conversation, but in the way one candidate would share water without asking or steady another's pack without comment. Still, there were moments when Sarah faltered. During a live-fire exercise, when the sound of gunfire tore through the air, her chest clenched. She thought of her father, of the bullets that had ended him. For half a heartbeat, her hands trembled. The instructor's voice cut sharp. "Martinez, steady." She exhaled, forced the fear down, fired again. Her shots landed true, but inside she carried the shame of that hesitation. That night she sat outside the barracks, staring at the stars, her rifle across her knees. Another candidate, Daniels, a quiet man with haunted eyes, sat beside her. "You froze," he said simply. "Not judgment, just fact." "I know. You pushed through." She glanced at him. "Is that enough?" His gaze stayed on the sky. "It has to be. None of us are perfect. We're just the ones willing to try again tomorrow." His words sank deep. She realized then that legacy wasn't built on flawless soldiers. It was built on broken ones who refused to quit. By the end of the month, only 10 remained, Sarah among them. Colonel Hawthorne addressed them in the cold dawn, her eyes scanning each face. "You are here because you have endured, but endurance is not enough. You must decide what you are willing to give. Task Force legacy demands silence, demands sacrifice, demands a life lived in the shadows. There will be no parades, no speeches, only missions that may never be spoken of." Sarah's chest tightened. The weight of the choice pressed again. She thought of her mother who had begged her not to do this. She thought of her grandmother who had said honor was worth sacrifice. She thought of herself, caught between fear and duty. And she thought of her father, whispering under a foreign sky, "Tell them it was worth it." When Colonel Hawthorne asked who was still willing, Sarah raised her hand. Not without fear, not without doubt, but with resolve. Training grew harsher. They learned infiltration, exfiltration, coded languages, how to move unseen and unheard. They were taught to vanish in plain sight, to live lives others would never question, while carrying truths that could never be spoken. One evening, after a grueling exercise, Sarah sat on her bunk, staring at her hands, calloused now, stronger but shaking. She pressed them together, whispering into the dark, "Am I strong enough?" And in the silence, she felt the faintest answer, not in words, but in the steadiness that returned to her breath, the fire that still burned in her chest. Strong enough to try. Weeks turned into months. The 10 became 8, each departure silent, each empty bunk a reminder of cost. Sarah carried on, her body hardened, her mind sharpened, but her heart still tender. Because beneath every drill, every mission, every coded lesson, one truth remained. She was not doing this for glory. She was doing it because of a man who had carried her picture into the dark, a man who had whispered it was worth it. And now she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, it could be worth it for her too. But deep down, she also knew she had not yet been tested the way he had. That test was coming, and she could feel it closing in, like the quiet before the storm. What happens when drills become decisions that carry lives on their backs? Sarah knew at the moment Colonel Hawthorne gathered the 8 of them in the windowless room. The air was too heavy, the silence too sharp. This wasn't training. On the table lay a map, red lines, circled coordinates, a photograph of a compound buried deep in the mountains of a country whose name wasn't spoken aloud. The colonel's voice cut the air. "This is not an exercise, this is operational. Intelligence confirms a weapons transfer scheduled within 72 hours. If successful, hundreds of soldiers could die. You will prevent it, quietly, cleanly, without acknowledgement." Sarah's pulse hammered. Training had always carried the safety net of simulation. This did not. This was real terrain, real enemies, real stakes. You will not speak of this outside this room, Hawthorne continued. Not to family, not to friends, not even to others in uniform. If you succeed, no one will know. If you fail, her gaze swept them. No one will know. The words settled like frost. 3 days later, under the cover of night, Sarah crouched in the belly of a transport plane. Her gear pressed against her body, heavy, suffocating. The hum of engines roared in her ears. Across from her, Daniels adjusted his rifle with steady hands. His eyes met hers. He gave a small nod, calm, grounding. She tried to breathe, in, out, like her father had taught her, but this wasn't the calm of a firing range. This was the storm. The jump came quick. Air slammed against her body as she fell through the dark, stars wheeling above, earth rushing to meet her. The chute deployed, jerking her hard, and she floated in eerie silence before hitting ground with practiced precision. They moved fast, low, silent, every step rehearsed but sharper now because mistakes meant more than correction, they meant death. The compound rose ahead, lights faint against the mountain's skin. Sarah's heart thudded as they slid into position. She found her perch, rifle steady, scope cutting through the dark. And then faces, men moving crates, weapons glinting, targets real, human. Her breath caught. Training hadn't prepared her for the weight of seeing eyes behind crosshairs. She hesitated, the same tremor that had haunted her during drills. Daniel's whisper crackled in her ear. "Martinez, you have Overwatch, confirm." Her finger hovered. She thought of her father, of the picture he had carried, of his words, "Tell them it was worth it." She exhaled, squeezed. The first shot cracked through the night, precise, clean. A man dropped, the mission began. Chaos surged, shadows moved, radios hissed with clipped commands. Her rifle barked again and again, each shot steadier than the last. Training took over, instinct sharper than fear. On the ground, her team advanced. Breaches, shouts, explosions muffled by suppressors and silence. She watched their backs through her scope, eyes scanning for threats. Then movement, 2 figures breaking toward her team's flank. She adjusted, breath steady, but one stumbled, dropping something metallic. Her heart lurched. Grenade. She didn't think. She fired, twice. Both figures fell. The grenade rolled harmlessly into dirt. Her chest heaved. The radio crackled clear. Minutes stretched like hours until the call finally came. Objective secured. Exfil in 5. They melted back into the dark, leaving the compound silent, smoke curling into the night. On the extraction bird, Sarah sat pressed against the bulkhead, rifle across her knees. Her hands shook now that the firing had stopped. She stared at them, willing them still. Daniels leaned close, his voice low. "You did it, don't forget that." She nodded, but her chest ached, because the image of the men through her scope wouldn't leave. Not the threat they carried, not the crates of weapons, but their eyes. She closed hers, pressing back tears. This was what legacy demanded: silence, sacrifice, shadows. Back at the facility, Colonel Hawthorne debriefed them with her usual steel. Objective complete, weapons intercepted, casualties prevented. She paused, eyes resting on Sarah. "Martinez, Overwatch was decisive. Without your shots, this mission ends differently." Sarah held her posture, jaw tight, but inside she fractured. Because behind every praise was the image of bodies dropping in the dirt, and behind every objective complete was the truth she could never tell her mother. That night, alone on her bunk, she replayed the mission. The adrenaline, the silence. The moment hesitation gave way to action, and the question she couldn't silence: is this who I am now? Sleep came late, broken by flashes, faces in her scope, the thud of falling bodies, the weight of silence pressing on her chest. She woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling. And yet when the alarm sounded, she rose, put on her boots, checked her rifle, because this was the path she had chosen. Over the following weeks, more missions followed, each one a blur of shadows and silence. Infiltration, extraction, always clean, always quiet. each one carving lines deeper into her. She grew sharper, quicker, more controlled, but also more hollow. Nights were filled with silence too loud to escape. She wrote letters she never sent. She dialed her mother's number but never pressed call. She carried the weight alone as her father had. And yet, there were moments that lit sparks in the dark. A village child spared because their mission cut off an arm's flow. A fellow operative whose life she saved with a shot through the night. Quiet victories no one would ever applaud. It was in those moments she felt her father beside her, not in pride but in presence. During one mission, crouched in the dirt after hours of waiting, Daniels whispered, "Do you ever wonder if anyone will know what we've done?" Sarah didn't answer at first. She thought of Arlington, of her mother's face as the Medal of Honor was handed over, of how long it had taken for truth to find daylight. Finally, she whispered back, "Maybe they don't need to. Maybe we just need to know." Daniels gave a faint smile in the dark. "That sounds like something your father would have said." Her throat tightened. She didn't answer, she couldn't. By the time months passed, Sarah had become what legacy demanded, a shadow, precise, silent, deadly when needed, and yet human, still carrying the ache of faces she couldn't forget. But even shadows face storms. And Sarah's storm was closer than she thought. Because the next mission would not test her skill, it would test her heart. And she would learn, some sacrifices cut deeper than bullets. What do you do when the mission isn't just about orders, but about who you are when the silence ends? Sarah felt the difference the moment the briefing began. The map laid out on the table was familiar: mountains, villages, roads etched like veins. But the photograph pinned to the corner hit harder than any target she'd seen. It wasn't the compound, not the crates of weapons. It was the faces: women, children, civilians. The colonel's voice was steady, but the edges carried something sharper. "Intelligence confirms insurgents are using this village as cover. Weapons caches are hidden among homes. Your orders: clear the caches, eliminate resistance, minimal footprint." Sarah's chest tightened. She scanned the photograph again. Children barefoot in dust, women drawing water from a well, shadows of men in doorways. The colonel's eyes met hers briefly, a flicker of warning, then, "You leave at 200. The ride in silence was worse than the roar of the plane. Sarah sat pressed against her gear, her thoughts louder than engines. She had fired at men with rifles, men moving crates meant to kill. But this was different. A village wasn't a target. A village was a heart still beating. When boots hit dirt, the night air felt colder than usual. They moved in formation, slipping between mud-brick walls. Sarah's rifle pressed against her shoulder, scope sweeping shadows. Whispers crackled in her earpiece, teams breaching houses, pulling apart rooms, finding weapons where families had once gathered. Sarah's stomach twisted as she stepped into one hut, her flashlight sweeping across stacked crates under woven mats. A child's toy lay abandoned on the floor. Her breath caught, the boy from the photograph. His wide eyes stared from the corner, frozen in fear. His mother's arms pulled him close, her lips whispering prayers Sarah couldn't understand. "Martinez, confirm clear," a voice hissed in her ear. Her finger tightened on the rifle. Training screamed at her, "Clear the room, secure the space." But another voice pushed harder, her father's, steady in memory. "Some lives are worth more than the mission." Her chest heaved. She lowered her weapon slightly. "Clear," she whispered, her voice cracked. They moved on, house after house. Weapons found. Resistance met with bursts of gunfire in the dark. Sarah's hands shook, her scope blurring as she pulled Overwatch. Every time she aimed, she wondered if the shadow in her sights was enemy or desperate villager caught in the crossfire. The mission ended hours later, caches destroyed, resistance silenced. They slipped back into the mountains before dawn. On the extraction bird, no one spoke. The silence wasn't pride this time, it was weight. Back at the facility, the debrief was clinical. Objective secured, minimal casualties. Colonel Hawthorne's eyes lingered on Sarah, reading something unspoken. She said nothing, but Sarah knew the colonel had seen her hesitation. That night Sarah couldn't sleep. The boy's eyes haunted her. The mother's whispered prayers. The way her finger had hovered, the choice she had made to say clear when her chest screamed otherwise. She sat outside under the stars, rifle across her knees, whispering into the dark, "Dad, how did you carry this?" The wind offered no answer, only silence. Days passed, but the weight didn't fade. Training resumed, missions continued, but every night she returned to that boy's eyes. Every time she cleaned her rifle, she thought of the toy lying in the dirt. Finally, she found herself in Colonel Hawthorne's office. The colonel looked up, surprised but unreadable. "Cadet No, Candidate Martinez, speak." Sarah's voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "How do you know when the mission is right, when silence is worth it?" The colonel studied her for a long moment. Then she leaned back, her voice quieter than Sarah had ever heard it. You carry it. And you pray the weight doesn't crush you. That's what legacy is. Not the missions, not the patches, the weight." Sarah's throat burned, she blinked hard. "Then why do it?" Hawthorne's gaze softened just slightly. "Because if we don't, someone else pays the price. Someone who can't carry it. Someone like that boy you saw." The words cut deep. Sarah left the office with her chest heavy but her steps steady. Weeks later, she stood in formation again. Not at Fort Braxton, not as a cadet, but as something else. The 8 had become 6, their faces leaner, eyes harder, but Sarah's gaze carried something different, not hardness but clarity. She thought of her father often, not as the hero spoken of at Arlington, not even as the soldier of Legacy 9, but as the man who had braided her hair, who had pointed at stars, who had whispered bedtime stories without ever telling her the battles he carried. Now she understood why. Some stories were too heavy for words. Some stories lived only in silence. The months blurred into years, missions carried out, shadows walked, victories no one celebrated, losses no one mourned aloud. And through it all, Sarah carried her father's picture tucked into her gear, the same way he had carried hers. One night, after a mission that ended with more questions than answers, she sat alone under foreign stars. She pulled the photograph out, tracing the edges with calloused fingers. And she whispered steady now, "It's worth it." Not because it was easy, not because it was clean, but because some legacies aren't about glory. They're about carrying weight so others don't have to. Years later, when her name appeared quietly on a promotion list, there was no parade, no speech, only a crisp uniform, a folded flag on her wall, and the memory of a father who had taught her that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it endures. And when she returned home on rare leave, standing in her mother's doorway with tired eyes and silent stories, her mother saw it too. The same fire her father had carried, the same silence, the same dignity. Sarah never spoke of the missions, never told the full truth, but in the way she walked, in the way she led, in the way she stood at Arlington years later for another ceremony, she carried it. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.